Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. It's so nice to see so many of you coming on into this ethicist-led case-based learning event today, and welcome on in to this N4 hosted session. Before we begin today's event, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and the peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them in this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and their valuable past and present contributions across this country as well. My name is Andrew Tomeyer. I go by the pronouns he, him, and I'm the Education Coordinator with N4. I will be hosting and moderating today's webinar presentation. My co-host as well is Colleen Drake, who will be helping assist today's session. And now I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator and our ethics coaches, Dr. Michelle Mullen, Consultant Bioethicist at CHIO and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at University of Ottawa, has received her undergraduate training in human physiology and psychology at the University of Toronto and her master's degree in health policy from University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. She's the first doctoral graduate from the Joint Centre in Bioethics at University of Toronto as well. She has numerous publications on bioethics and issues related to women and children's health, genetics, clinical ethics, and informed decisions in public policy. Dr. Mullen's current research interests include method in bioethics and health policy with a focus on transforming vulnerabilities, attention to voices historically silenced, truly informed decision-making, and healthcare policy. As well, we have our ethics coaches here, including June Koike. June is a public health professional in Ottawa with training in bioethics. June has worked in infectious diseases research and LGBTQ plus health for many years and is currently a public health project manager with the Society for Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. As well, Christine Corey has over 30 years of experience in the Canadian healthcare system and is known for initiatives and experience in equitable healthcare across socioculturally diverse and marginalized populations. Upon obtaining her master's in health and administration, she was recruited to CHIO to lead the development of the patient experience department. And as manager for that department, she has led CHIO's efforts to ensure an optimal experience for many, including the Syrian refugees that were welcomed to Ottawa in early 2016, leading to her oversight of the N4 project. Christine continues to lead this health equity efforts for the most vulnerable patients and families, including those of newcomers. Colleen Drake brings over 15 years of experience in supporting professional development and various other planning events within healthcare. Colleen was the key coordinator in our successful inaugural N4 conference and now supports commitment to stakeholder engagement and coordinating knowledge translation strategies for our many subject matter experts. Welcome on in today, and thank you for joining us. With regards to recording, the main didactic presentation of today's event will be recorded, and a recording will be available following today's session to those who are invited to the event. To allow for a safe space for dialogue and exploration, the breakout rooms will not be recorded. As well, a few housekeeping items that we want to attend to before we jump into the discussion today. We do ask that you keep yourself on mute, unless of course you're in a breakout room or you're asking a question. Please use the raise hand symbol under, I believe there's emotes, but please use the raise hand function to make a comment before making a comment, and notify us if you have a question. We also encourage you to turn on your video today if you're comfortable doing so. However, this is optional. Along with that, today's topic is an extremely complex and heavy discussion. We ask for respectful discussion to occur. Please and thank you. And so, in terms of today's agenda, today's event will begin with a short didactic from Dr. Michelle Mullen. We'll then use breakout room feature to randomly split the group into 2 to 3 breakout rooms for the discussions alongside some key relevant cases for about 30 minutes. Each group will be assigned a case and engaged in a discussion led by an ethics coach. One person from each group will be invited to report back to the whole group after the breakout rooms end, and there will be an opportunity for future questions and comments as well once we group back together. Dr. Mullen will then conclude with some take-home messages as well. And with that said, I'd like to pass this discussion over to Dr. Mullen. Thank you again, and take it away.
Michelle.
I believe you're on mute, Michelle.
There, yay! It's been a challenging technology day. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. And I'm hoping that someone will tell me you can see. Give me a thumbs up, Andrew, if you can see the screen.
We can see the slides, yeah.
That is perfect. Welcome, everyone, and especially to this particular session, which is challenging, and many people might want to shy away from something. So kind of like kudos to everyone just for being on board for this. And I hope that it's an important topic unto itself, and of course dealing with the many difficult and complex situations that we as a diverse society encounter in healthcare is a good model for learning how we manage our own beliefs and keep them, honor them, and at the same time honor our obligations to patients and families. So that's terrific. And I thank you for being here today to do that. So we already did this. So this is really this didactic. This first part will be, I want to kind of define medical abortion or abortion within healthcare. I want to give because it's relevant, a very brief history, and it's a complex and interesting history of abortion law in particular and policy in Canada. And then a look at what professional responsibility. So those are the legal and ethical and licensing requirements. That there is, I hope you received a rubric, a kind of checklist of things to help guide your thinking, and then we'll move on to the session. So without further ado, let's see. So to define therapeutic abortion, really abortion, just the word refers to the ending of a pregnancy. This can happen naturally, and you might hear this referred to as a spontaneous abortion, or commonly called a miscarriage. Abortions can also be induced, so it may happen using either medical or surgical methods. So we're just going to move this here. This is also sometimes referred to as a termination of pregnancy or therapeutic abortion. Abortions can be undertaken for many, many different reasons. Personal reasons where someone is in their life, social considerations, mental and physical health reasons, and other forms of safety. I hope that in the cases as we discuss them, we'll start to see at least a hint of the breadth of circumstances which can raise this as a consideration for patients. And and at the same time, we'll be trying to balance it with the idea that can help us, and something to help us support patients appropriately. But there is a right to abortion within Canada, and it doesn't really need to be justified. So medical abortion isn't, and this is also pharmacological abortion, is something which is induced by using two different medication. The first of the medications, which can be taken at home or in a physician's office or in the healthcare provider's office, blocks progesterone, which is a kind of growth and development hormone which helps the placenta and so forth, so that the embryo then detaches from the uterine wall. And then a second medication taken sometime later causes the uterus to contract and then the contents to be expelled. And this is very much like an early spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. That experience, it can be performed up to 7 or 8 weeks gestation would be typical. And although some people prefer the privacy of this, it can be done in your home. It does require access, if something were to go awry, that the person would have access to emergency services if they were required, and also a return visit, a follow-up examination 14 days later usually, just to make sure that everything has been cleared up. First trimester surgical abortion is something which is almost always performed on an outpatient basis, without anesthesia, although some persons might have some sedation for this, or anxiolytic, and sometimes some numbing of the cervix, but it involves gentle dilation of the cervix and then a vacuum aspiration of the contents of the uterus. And it doesn't take all that long, and patients go home the same day or the same morning or afternoon, and then we'll follow up with their regular practitioner. Later abortions, which are quite rare actually in Canada, this third trimester abortions are almost unheard of, but second trimester abortions do happen, but are still incredibly rare, are more complex surgical procedures depending on the circumstances. So why is this such a topic? And again, this is my brief history. Prior to 1869, there was no law governing abortion in Canada like much of the Western world, although there were different practices. And for a very long time in Western cultures, procedures that would cause a pregnancy to end were considered acceptable up until the time of what used to be known as quickening, when a pregnant person could feel the movement of a fetus in the uterus. But around 1869, the practice actually became criminalized in Canada, as it did in much of the world, except under very narrow circumstances. And this was a subject of ongoing debate, of course. Abortion didn't go away, but it certainly went underground. And in that going underground, there were odd things that happened. Certainly people who were had more means and more financial means would, perhaps be able to seek a D&C, a dilatation curative procedure, which is a more generic term for, looking at the contents of the uterus. But poorer persons who couldn't afford that were typically, sought out termination of pregnancy in ways which were very dangerous in terms of their health and their fertility, and indeed their lives. And it was not uncommon for women to lose their lives prior to 1969 in seeking to terminate pregnancies. That was true in Canada. It was also true in the UK, in the US, and much of the Western world. So in 1969, there was an amendment under the criminal code which legalized therapeutic abortions. And what it required was a committee of, I believe it was 3 physicians, to certify that continuing a pregnancy would be likely to endanger the woman's life or health. And health came to be fairly broadly defined as, mental health, physical health, sort of sense of well-being. Later, and so it was still not easy to obtain an abortion, but it could be done legally. One person who kind of really resisted this was Dr. Henry Morgentaler, who openly offered first in Montreal abortion services in clinic, and was repeatedly arrested and charged, and indeed spent time in jail more than once because of his belief that it should be freely available and a legal procedure for women to be able to access unencumbered. And finally, in 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in a challenged by the Crown versus Morgentaler that the law, as it had been construed, was unconstitutional and violated a woman's rights to life, liberty, and security of persons, which had been guaranteed under the then relatively new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So a big shift from 1988, and it meant that abortion clinics could, which they did in certain parts of the country, appear and were no longer subject to sanction by the law. At that time, the Supreme Court recommended that Parliament propose another law. That's not been attempted for a long time now, because attempts generally have just failed to pass Parliament. There was not a way, and this is, I guess, a little bit of the story we're talking about today, to get everyone on board on what a law would look like. Often people consider it either too oppressive or too liberal, and small L liberal, and people were not able to come up with a law. And I would just, as an aside, say I think there's currently no appetite for our Parliament to try, under our circumstances, to make another law. There's an important landmark case in 1989, and this was brought by a man, Jean-Guy Tremblay, against his former girlfriend, Chantal Daigle, who was pregnant, had become pregnant with him. And he sought an injunction to prevent her from ending the pregnancy. They had had a long and violent relationship, and she had left him, Tremblay, after he continued to physically assault her, according to her, even after she became pregnant. And the case found for Ms. Daigle and also in general that this was a decision that women could undertake. It was Tremblay, and she proceeded, she'd gone off and had terminated the pregnancy, but he continued to appeal on this sort of basis of, are there paternal rights to protect the fetus? And the court found, even at the 2005 Supreme Court appeal, that it was not upheld. It did emerge at that time that, in fact, he had been convicted in the assaults of more than 14 women. So not a poster boy for this. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of her right to choose. The court was really clear to state the ruling was based on the legal status of the fetus, and they were very careful to not engage in philosophical or they're very pointed or theological debates. And they did assert there was no precedent for men's rights to protect a potential progeny. So again, no Canadian law at this time. The practice, however, because it is a healthcare practice, is controlled and governed by professional standards. And I would say, and although there is practical access, the access across Canada is quite variable, with some communities and some, and I believe some provinces still not having any services whatsoever. So what do we do with this as healthcare providers and in our professional role, given it's such a challenging and difficult topic on both sides or various fronts for so many people? What we do know is this as professionals, that therapeutic abortion is a controlled act under various regulated health professions. So a place to start to understand what one's obligations are, and we're doing some of the work today, is to actually look through, contact. Everyone has online services now. Your regulatory college, or if you're trying to become certified, who your regulatory college would be, and access their information on managing this issue. But in general, these are the sorts of folk who are involved. Surgical and non-invasive medical abortions in Canada are provided on request for any reason. They're confidential for all ages and funded for those who are covered by provincial and territorial medical plans. So that's a uniform approach from the colleges, licensing bodies. Nationally, because there's, in the absence of a law, abortion would be legal through all 9 months, 40 weeks of pregnancy, although all terminations are extremely rare beyond 24 weeks. Far more than 90% occur in the first trimester of pregnancy. And I think I'd said earlier that third trimester abortions occur. I think I've seen one example in 30 years. Medical, and by medical I mean pharmacological abortions, abortions that are induced by taking medication, are available from physicians, and in some circumstances, midwives, nurse practitioners, and pharmacists as well, if they have the supportive services that are required for that. And that has been a way of expanding in early pregnancy women's access to this reproductive support. Surgical abortion, however, is only provided by licensed doctors who are trained in the area. Important caveat here, no healthcare provider is required to provide these services. So clearly there are persons who would not in conscience be able to do this. They are not required to provide these services. No one would be compelled to do this. However, providers must provide care and appropriate referral in a timely manner for patients who present to them. So we look after, if you're not going to be actually providing services, you do provide care and in a timely manner. And I think we'll see in at least one of the cases that that kind of physical care part can be very important. But it is just in general that respect and compassion is owed all of the patients that we encounter in our environments. And the fiduciary relationship between a care provider, and that means to take their interests or put them first, and the duty of care remain until the referral is complete. And that really, and it does have to happen in a timely way for obvious reasons. So those are the broad strokes of what governs the way as healthcare providers we look at this as professionals. Of course, how we look at these things as individuals is as complex and diverse as our community. But we will be using the rubric with a focus on a few things in particular to look at cases. And first of all, our first question is, do principles or laws apply? And for sure, we know there's illegal vacuums, which means that there is access throughout pregnancy. And we know that regulatory colleges have said what things need to look like and that these are protected practices. And in particular, principles that apply here really are around privacy and autonomy. I hope we see this in the cases. I think it is very worthwhile to ask if a trauma-informed approach is appropriate. Persons present for many different reasons, considering termination of pregnancy. So we have to recognize that the person in front of us may well be themselves traumatized, and then we need to address that. Are there issues of intersectionality? Again, we know that accessing services for certain kinds of vulnerabilities can be quite difficult as those different vulnerabilities, as those lenses of difference multiply. Accessing services can become increasingly difficult. We need to consider risks and benefits of options and to whom they accrue, because often there may be, at least on the periphery, parties with an interest, whether that is legitimized or not. And then is what we're about to do, is it fair and equitable? Is it fair to the patient in front of us? Is it equitable with what other persons in the circumstance would receive? And then narrative. This is a funny one in the circumstance, because I actually think that understanding a little bit of the stories of how folk come to be in a situation is really powerful. And certainly there may be conditions that are challenging, the roles of family and culture. There are different mores around this. At the same time, I think we need to remember that a person who's presenting, looking for the service, kind of doesn't have to justify. They don't have to share everything because the access is guaranteed. I'm not sure how much this one applies, but what are the kind of constraints that we must work with? And sometimes the constraints are resource, and they could be in this circumstance, but also the constraint may be the degree to which a healthcare provider is able to empathize or work with the community. How will you include others in your problem solving? I think this is important because the issues are difficult, and this is a first step, the learning and the teaching and the beginning to think about these difficult issues. Really important if we can identify people within our work context who can support us as we face challenging issues. And of course, at a distance, but with great, ability to inform what the professional practice needs to be are things like the licensing colleges. I've highlighted this one because I think this is one of those, amongst other circumstances, where knowing what your own values and experiences are is really, really helpful in understanding how these might affect how you see things, how you might interact with someone. And underlying all of this is, in this context, what is your professional role? And then finally, what are the goals of the plan and how are they assessed? And I think the plan, of course, first and foremost is how are we helping the patient in front of us? And, assessment may be, follow-up or speaking with them afterwards, or even if you've referred someone along because they've not, or because they're seeking a service you don't provide, how is it you're balancing, like when this is completed, if you're working in a more general health context, that they will feel safe and welcome to come back to get services from you. And then some of the goals are, how are you managing this as well, and what are you learning, and how do we identify where we need supports. So we're going to move into, sorry, just looking at the time here ahead of time, a small group discussions, and these will be mediated by our wonderful ethics coaches. So really the goal of the case discussion is to develop an approach for managing the case in front of you. And these are clinical/social scenarios. And the guidance for this comes from the law and the licensing bodies, and is specifically not a debate about abortion. We know it's documented that debate about abortion precedes 1869 in this country. And so I don't think it's something we can resolve. And the Supreme Court, who's wiser than I am, certainly on these issues, has decided to put it aside. So I think it's an important point, but we really have to think about, how do we manage ourselves? How do we, honor who we are, and honor being the best healthcare professionals we can be. So I think, in fact, today it's not 4 breakout rooms, it's 3 breakout rooms. Each group will be discussing one case. I'm going to stress that they are fictitious cases, an amalgam of lots of circumstances I've seen over the years. I'm going to ask that each of you select a reporter to kind of just feedback, what was useful, what were the issues that came up in the case, what you thought you addressed, what you thought you might want some support in addressing, and that person would be asked to just come back and give a very brief summary of that for the large group discussion, which will happen around each of the cases, but after the individual groups have had a chance to consider these. The rubric is a guide only, please. It's not, there's nothing sacred about it, and the cases may well generate many questions. And remember, the task is developing an approach for now, and that's what ethics is. It's what's the best thing we can do today, and not to try and solve a problem forever. You will get a 2-minute warning, I think, when time is finishing, and there'll be an automatic return to the large group for discussion and wrap up. So, Andrew, I think this is where magically people are shifted randomly into rooms. Is that how that works?
Yes, and looking at the number of participants right now, I think we're only going to split into 2 for the first 2 cases. And then if more come on in, we can gladly split them out into case 1 or case 2.
You know what, Andrew, is it possible to do cases 1 and 3? Because
Sure.
the reason being is I'm just thinking one's an early and one's later, and I just think in terms of learning, that might be is it nimble enough to do that?
Sure, that works. That works just as well. We will have June's breakout group with case 1, and Christine's and Colleen's combined breakout group into case 3.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being attending to my whims.
Of course. I'm going to stop the recording now,
Okay.
as we